Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll walk you through the process of modeling, UV unwrapping and texturing a simple character, the Heronbot. The video is sped up by 6 times, and I've cut out a couple of repetitive moments, nothing major. If you want to follow along, you can always rely on the subtitles, mute my audio, put on some good music, and slow the video down by 4 times. The table of contents is also at your service, check the video description and pinned comment for the chapter list. Also, you can always inspect the model on Sketchfab. Let's start with a couple of clarifications. I modeled this character in 3ds Max 2024. For UV unwrapping, I used Rizom UV. I really like its straightening algorithm. Of course, you can unwrap your model in any software, but I wouldn't recommend doing it in Max, at least not without specialized plugins. I textured the model in Substance Painter. For this, I used only the basic Substance Painter materials, plus a free material from Fred Taylor, which I grabbed from his ArtStation page. His YouTube channel is named Stylized Craft. This material doesn't work miracles, but I love the way it lets me quickly play with gradients, edge highlights, lighting, and other similar settings. The only plugin I use in Max is the Loop Regularizer. You can also use Rapid tools and get the same result. The heart sticker was something I drew in Photoshop for one of my previous models. Now Substance Painter has a handy tool to add it to your model in just a couple of clicks. Unfortunately, I made a couple of mistakes during modeling, mainly with the robot's arms, which could have easily been modeled in a T-pose. I'll explain that part in more detail when we get to it. I haven't animated this character and don't plan to anytime soon. The hand-painted stylization was done using Substance Painter tools. Before we start, let's describe the character. Our robot has 8.8K polygons and roughly the same number of vertices. I didn't use the classic process of baking a high poly model onto a low poly one. Instead, I opted for the use low poly model as high poly while baking setting. This isn't the best approach, as we're still using a normal SMAP, and could have gotten much better results with proper baking. My workflow is best suited for those of you who can confidently paint your character. As with my other models, I start with NURBS modeling while setting the iteration count to 2, and then shape the head and the body of the robot. Later, I subtract spheres from the model using the ProBlend tool and clean up the topology manually. Theoretically, we could achieve the same results by applying automatic retopology to one side of the character's head, though in that case we'd need to ensure the holes don't have too many sides. For the eyes, I leave 14 sides, for the beak 16, for the neck 14, and for the antennas and wart-like connectors on the chin 8 each. The holes on the connectors are made as follows. We apply a chamfer to the vertex, tessellate the resulting polygon, then delete it and apply the loop regularizer to its edges. Since I wasn't working from a specific reference image, my approach was to add antennas to the parts of the robot's head where they would fit naturally. The remaining jacks were left open. For the beak, I modeled it as a loft object using loft settings to subtly adjust its trajectory. I ensured the loft had the same number of sides as the head opening for consistency. Each technical detail received a single chamfer, as did each intersection. To maintain clean geometry, I surrounded every intersection with a loop of near-square polygons. Basically, the only thing to consider at this stage is to not to overextend with your poly count. 8 sides are more than enough for various antennas and stuff. I prefer to create models like this as a single cohesive objects rather than assembling them from separate components. While it would be possible to insert the eye tubes into the robot's head and attach the antennas as individual parts, which could reduce the overall polygon count and simplify the model, this approach comes with challenges. Specifically, care must be taken to avoid Z-fighting, a common issue in 3D rendering where two surfaces are positioned so closely together that the rendering engine struggles to determine which one should be displayed. This can result in visual artifacts such as flickering or overlapping textures, which compromise the model's appearance. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have given the beak 16 sides, 12 would have been just right, however, the difference is minimal. It would have been easy to use fewer sides where the beak connects to the head, which would have added triangles. Since this area is flat and doesn't move during animation, the triangles wouldn't cause issues. I could have removed some of the extra edge loops from the beak, but they help maintain its slight curve. Finally, I position the beak in its place, align it to the head and create two spherical eyeballs. You can also move some vertices around at this point if you need to. Make sure to rotate your model now and then and observe its shading closely. As you can see, we got two triangles right above the beak, but it's not a big deal since everything happens on a flat surface. Also, the intersection begs of a single chamfer. The beak's tip also receives a single chamfer. Make sure its vertices aren't positioned too close to each other. We will also give our model a weighted normals modifier at some point. In order to attach the beak, I simply bridge it to the rest of the head, deleting any intersecting planes. Finally, I put eyeballs in their sockets using the Select and Place tool, and position them properly while switching my coordinate system to local. The shoulders get 18 sides, while the arms get 12. This reduction creates a few triangles, but they are placed on flat areas of the model that won't deform during animation. The collar also gets 12 sides. The basic shape of the body is made the same way we have modeled the head, by using the NURMS process with its iteration count set to 2. The holes on the back, where the mushrooms grow, are made using the cut tool. I slightly pull their edges out from the character's back to give the impression that the metal was dented and pierced from the inside. I didn't want to add too many details to the front of the robot's torso. Overall, I just make it so that the decorative rounded wings appear on sides of the character, from which their arms grow. The connectors for the arms and neck each get a single chamfer. You can slightly adjust the vertices of these chamfers to create an illusion of slightly uneven torn edges. The lower part of the body gets 28 sides, clearly excessive for the character's waist, so I select every other side and use the Collapse tool, reducing the waist to 14 sides. The trick with the Propoline tool here is to give our cutter object the amount of sides that matches the amount of sides of its surroundings, so that we don't have to improvise weirdly with our topology. It is always a good idea to encircle the intersection with a single loop of near square polygons. When shaking the composition, the goal is to make the connectors for the arms, neck and waist share noticeable similarities. You also need to think through the model's overall composition. I didn't create a blockout, a bad idea in most cases. Ideally, if you are making a model for a specific game, you should gather some environment details and test the blockout in an engine like Unreal Engine 4 before building the character. Also, I didn't have a reference, just a couple of stylized heron images on my phone screen. Overall, the symmetry is only broken at the back of the model. I wanted to break it at the front too, so I added a heart sticker during texturing. For me, an ideal model is one where we can identify 6 sides, each telling a part of its story. This stylized cartoony character has few elements, so ensure the ones you create are thick enough and avoid small details that could disrupt the overall harmony. Maintain consistent design approaches, such as applying a single chamfer to mechanical components for a cohesive look. I've trimmed the bottom part of the body because I've decided to go for a rubber waist and a body that consists of 2 parts, including the torso and the leg module. For the holes in the back, I don't chamfer their edges, as this would be impractical. Instead, I slightly enlarge their inner cavities for better definition. I've edited out the part of the video showing the creation of multiple holes, as each is made using the same method as the first one. The character's neck is built as a spline between 2 points, the center of the neck connector on the head and the center of the neck connector on the torso. I add 2 vertices to this spline and switch them to smooth mode. Since we'd animate this character using a bone system, we can safely combine the head, neck and torso into a single object. At this point I've noticed that the neck-torso connector was pretty massive, so I've created its inner part mimicking existing shoulder connectors. Make sure the neck has enough supporting edge loops to ensure proper movement and bending. The neck itself is created as a loft object. I gave it 12 sides, generally that's enough. Finally, I've created a waist connector in the center of the bottom part of the robot's body. Make sure to trim down the amount of its sides. After the neck is complete, I moved on to modeling the mushrooms. I created them from spheres with 16 sides, transitioning into stems with 8 sides. Triangles appeared at the base of the mushrooms, but I don't see any issue with that. I distorted some of the mushroom caps using the noise tool. You can achieve similar results with the FFD 4x4 modifier. I also added a couple of tiny mushrooms with caps that have 8 sides each. I didn't record the process of modeling each mushroom. They were made the same way over and over until I was fully satisfied with the composition. In fact, smaller mushrooms might get away with as many as 5 sides. We don't want to trim down the poly count of stems though, since they add a lot of detail to our model. I played with my lofts a little bit, altering their curves ever so slightly. Finally, each mushroom was attached and breached to the rest of my model. The waist was formed similarly to the head, but in this case I used automated retopology. I went through several iterations until I got one with an acceptable amount of sides for the leg connector. Its upper part got 16 sides, while the leg itself got 8. The top of the waist also received 16 sides. Since we are relying on automated retopology, we want our cutter object to have a significant amount of sides, and we also want to work on one side of the model, mirroring it to the other side once we are happy with the results. Obviously, the ideal case for us is to get a hole with a poly count that is equal to a supposed poly count of our legs. We can always trim the poly count down though, and maybe even introduce some triangles. The only thing that matters at this stage is to not to overextend with the amount of sides, while also keeping our shading nice and proper. Make sure to position the lower side of our torso the way its center matches the central part of its upper counterpart. I connected the waist and the robot's torso and gave it enough sides to allow for bending. Additionally, I applied a single chamfer to it. I modeled the boots using NURMS with 2 iterations. Their soles got 40 sides each, which is definitely excessive. Overall, we could significantly reduce the polygon count of the footwear. The upper part of the boots received 8 sides. I positioned the boots and connected them to the waist, adding joints that will later receive a rubber texture. In general, the joints should have enough supporting edge loops to allow them to bend without deforming during animation. Overall, the boots don't require much detail. They'll almost always be far from the camera, unless we specifically want to create cinematics focused on the footwear. In any case, the polygon count of our boots could easily be cut in half. One iteration of NURMS would have been enough. We don't need to keep a large number of supporting edge loops for smoothing. In general, the same results could have been achieved by simply baking a high poly boot onto a low poly one. Additionally, the boots won't bend during animation, which further reduces the need for extra geometry. I methodically reduced the geometry on the soles of the boots. In reality, this wasn't necessary, as we could have just used the bridge tool or simply created a pole vertex. The legs received 8 sides. I left the rigid parts without additional supporting edge loops, giving each rubber joint at least 3 supporting edge loops to ensure they bend properly. Overall, this design will make it harder to use simple rigging tools like AccuRig. At the very least, after rigging, we'd have to manually adjust all the weights. I also gave the joints metallic borders with chamfers. I'm not sure if this was necessary. Theoretically, we could always just paint these details. The fingers were the simplest, created using polygonal modeling. After achieving the desired shape and proportions, I added a single iteration of Turbo Smooth. I aligned the top of each finger along its corresponding axis and adjusted their positions, giving each finger 3 supporting edge loops. Additionally, I added a slight curve to the fingers and palm and applied chamfers to shape the finger pads. Next, I modeled the thumbs using polygonal modeling. In general, the thumbs don't need to be animated unless that's a specific goal. It depends on the character's purpose. It was important not to make the fingers and palm too small. Since we're working on a stylized cartoony character, the details should be kept thick enough to maintain the overall aesthetic. I adjusted the length of the fingers to ensure the hand didn't look like a fork. In retrospect, I realize I should have given the palm a greater curve to make it appear more organic. The number of sides in the wrist opening determined the number of sides in the robot's arms, 12. The arms were made the same way as the legs and received the same joints with additional supporting edge loops, which would bend if we decided to animate this model. Here I made a mistake. I could have easily rotated the arms 90 degrees and attached them to the robot in a T-pose, so they would bend naturally during animation. Instead, I made the shoulders curved at a wrong angle. Overall, this is easy to fix as I can simply save my materials as a single smart material in Substance Painter and apply them to the updated model, but it will require additional time, what a pity. In general, before adding the arms, it's important to understand how they will bend. Naturally, starting from a T-pose is the easiest approach. Also, you should avoid having the arms sink into the shoulders, as this can cause the rigid edges of the shoulders to intersect with the limbs during animation. I wanted to make the upper parts of the arms, between the elbows and shoulders, slightly curved, but I didn't consider that this would make it difficult for them to straighten into a line. This was the main mistake I mentioned earlier. Theoretically, we could have avoided this by, for example, using a bend modifier or modeling in a T-pose. I created the second arm by applying symmetry. In general, it could have been made slightly different or damaged. This would have enhanced the aesthetic of our model and emphasized its infection by fungi or some other organic matter. The arms can be attached to the body and treated as a single object. For animation, we would rely on a bone system. This part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset my Heronbot's pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set his pivot point to the bottom of his middle part, and place him to 000 scene coordinates. You'll likely place his center between the middles of the soles of his boots, so that he can rotate around his central axis. Then I use a selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's X-View tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. I had some isolated vertices, so I made a couple of boxes, attached them to those parts of my mesh that had isolated vertices, and then deleted the boxes. In most cases, this method fixes the bug. If you added some extra elements to the robot's exterior, make sure they intersect him and each other properly and don't share any vertices or planes. At this point, you shall also reset the scale, rotation and X-form of most elements, and set their pivot points manually, remembering their proper initial rotation angles. If you used mirroring or symmetry while modeling, it's especially important to reset the X-form of your model and make sure that there are no flipped normals remaining. Just make sure to save your file before resetting the X-form. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradation. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tends to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks and shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling and chamfering these edges and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. In case of my robot, we don't need to worry about where to place hard edges. Most technical details were given a single chamfer, and accordingly, these chamfers receive their own smoothing groups. Overall, I shouldn't have split the model into separate objects, including the character's neck and arms. They could have all been combined. As a takeaway, I'd also like to say that this character definitely should have been modeled in a T pose. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 4K Reso UV map with a pixel padding of 32. That's pretty generous for this kind of a character, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. We can easily scale it down to 2K Reso. It may work for some indie project, but the real production grade thing would require some sculpted and hand-painted details and much more optimization. After all, we want to pull the maximum of existing UV maps. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. Make sure to straighten the antenna, hands, legs and other cylindrical objects for obvious reasons. At some point we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix no matter what tricks you try. I unwrap the model to ensure no overlapping UV elements. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically depending on their location. I mostly rely on Rizom's Optimize tool, O hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. To ensure a smooth animation, we need to straighten the UV chucks for all parts of the model that will bend, such as the robot's joints and neck. Properly aligned UVs prevent texture stretching or warping during deformation, maintaining visual quality. Additionally, when unwrapping these areas, we should ensure sufficient resolution in the UV map to preserve detail and avoid pixelation. It's also a good practice to place seams strategically along less visible edges to minimize noticeable texture distortions during animation. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the Clone Stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. During the UV unwrapping phase, I hadn't yet decided to add a heart-shaped sticker to the robot's chest. In hindsight, knowing this, I would have scaled up the UV chucks for the chest area to provide more texture space, allowing for higher resolution and sharper details for the sticker. While this is less critical when using 4K textures, it becomes significantly more important with 2K textures, where limited resolution can cause the sticker to look blurry, particularly around its edges and any detailed elements like scratches or wear. To enhance the visual quality of the robot's eyes, I scaled up the UV chucks allocated to them, allowing for greater detail in the pupils. My goal was to design organic-looking eyes that feel lifelike but avoid unsettling details such as red veins to maintain a stylized rather than creepy aesthetic. If you intend to sculpt the mushrooms or apply more intricate texture details than I did, you should also increase the size of the UV chucks for those areas to accommodate higher resolution and finer details. In retrospect, I made a questionable choice by reducing the UV chucks for the soles of the boots. This could impact their appearance in scenes where they are visible, such as when the character walks towards the camera in cutscenes, potentially resulting in lower texture quality or less details. Additionally, I enlarged the UV chucks for all joints and articulations to support my plan to give them a rubbery appearance during texturing. This ensures that the texture details, such as creases, are clearly visible and well defined. To further optimize your model, I recommend keeping UV distortions to a minimum and aligning the UV islands for these areas to preserve texture clarity during animation or deformation. I noticed a small error in the model and fixed it in 3ds Max, and then repacked my UV chucks in Rizom UV. 3ds Max shows flipped and overlapping UV chucks, while Rizom UV highlights areas where UV chucks are bent or stretched. Overall, we could stack some UV chucks, such as the lower chamfers of the limbs, since they not only take up space on the UV map, but also create a surrounding radius that other elements can't occupy. These other elements could have been slightly larger instead. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disabled the ID section, and switched my subsampling to 16. I have also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. In Substance Painter, I create a couple of layers using the Still Painted Chip Dirty preset Smart material. I tweak their settings, with the second layer receiving a preset Paint All Smart mask. At this stage, it's still too early to define the colors of the elements, unless of course you have a reference image and a prepared color palette. I prefer to start with muted and dark tones to form the character's color blockout. Then, once all the layers and masks are assigned, I bring the colors together, gradually making them brighter. Before filling the black masks, you can apply a single material to the character. This way, if you miss painting a couple of polygons, they'll get a default material rather than staying white and glossy. The robot's beak also received the Still Painted Chip Dirty material. I like the chipped paint effect at its tip, it's exactly the gradient I'd want to use for this model. The hard metallic parts of the limbs were given the Still Painted Scraped Dirty Smart material. I added a single grunge to the model, a fill layer with a Dirt Leak dry mask. The holes where mushrooms grow were textured with simple rust. The joints received the standard Rubber Dry Smart material. I used two versions of the same material in different colors, but for the second one, I added a height data layer with a slightly reduced height. For the other one, I also added a mask with a stripes fill layer. The stripes are initially large and tilted at a 45-degree angle. I adjusted the angle to make the stripes horizontal and increased the layer styling. I used this approach for nearly all my robots. Usually, the more grunges a model has, the better, but not in this case, as we rely on an artificial stylization tool and don't want the model to look too dirty. Stylization reworks textures to appear painted, so we should avoid excessive strokes that we don't want to emphasize. The mushrooms are textured with the help of Fred Taylor's smart material borrowed from his ArtStation page I've mentioned earlier. I'll provide a link to his video in the description. As I've already mentioned, the material doesn't work wonders, but it allows us to play with color gradients, edge highlights, baked light, and other stuff like that fast and easy without making a couple of our own masked fill layers. At some point, I duplicate the material I've set up, alter its color, put it into a folder that also has a hide data fill layer, mask the folder, and finally paint some spots on mushroom caps. Spot edges may become blurry if we reduce our resolution at some point. In order to avoid it, it may be better for us to increase the size of UV chucks responsible for our mushroom caps during the UV unwrapping phase. Rubber joints may receive some dust or dirt crunches to make them look weathered and old. However, we may want to experiment with a stylization filter and some of its settings if we add more grunges. Otherwise, we risk the dirty look I mentioned before. At this stage, we want to use rubber material for any bendable parts. Applying rubber material to the robot's gloves justifies finger bending. For the eyes, I used the creature skin smart material and a black fill layer for the pupils. I also reduced the roughness for the pupils to make them glossy when the eyes rotate. The black parts of the eyes I made received ambient occlusion during baking. I don't particularly want to change this. The yellowish tint resembles classic sclera and doesn't need correction. The back parts of the eyes turned out dark, but they'll never rotate in a way that makes this noticeable. Finally, I've made a couple of fill layers that only contain curvature and ambient occlusion data. I switched their blending options to overlay. We can always play with their blending opacity setting, the way they add some nice shadows. I've applied my heart sticker that I've made for a different model via a built-in sticker tool. I've set its UV wrap setting to none, altered its styling, played with its rotation, and put it in its place. I also applied a ground dirt gradient to my model. Make sure not to make its brush strokes too noisy when we apply stylization. Next I added the stylization and played around with its settings, especially the amount of brush strokes. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.